appropriate in certain circumstances. Some people deal better with questions or challenges than others. So is there a line between what is appropriate or acceptable to question and what is not? Well, just think about your own life. Is there a line that is appropriate or acceptable for someone to question you about? Of course there's a line. And you may not always know that line until you're asked a question and you go, whoa, that's totally out of bounds. So is there anything too sacred to be challenged? Yeah, I'm sure there are questions that I could ask you that you would regard as like way too sacred to be challenged. So like you generally don't make fun of a guy's mother. Like guys tend to be like sensitive about, if you make too much fun of his mother. So yeah, there are lines, and the lines are different with different people in Orthodox Judaism. They're different in different circumstances. What do you think, Monica?
Yeah, no, I think you're right, but I think it's also important to note that, well, at least from my perspective, I mean, it seems to me that there's a very profound spirit of challenging and questioning that's built into Judaism, into Jewish thought, in a way that isn't built into other religious traditions. If you think about the Talmud, the way the Talmud is constructed, it's a number of competing voices, competing opinions. Half the time there'll be an argument about a certain issue, and it's never really resolved. But I think what we're supposed to take away from a lot of those unresolved arguments is this idea of questioning and challenging being important as a process, not necessarily as a product in terms of finding out or determining the final answer, but in terms of engaging in a dialogue that's characterized by very spirited discussion and challenging and questioning. So, I mean, that's one of the things I love about Judaism, that is not present, at least in my experience, in Christianity. Judaism...
Yeah, if you've ever dealt with Jews, you know that they tend to ask a lot of questions. They're quite willing to stand up and to challenge you. Like I had a non-Jewish friend who was teaching at a retreat about vegetarianism, and some Jew got up and said, "I've never heard such nonsense in my entire life," and she was just absolutely appalled because Protestants don't speak that way.
No.
So Jews tend, like I've spoken before Jewish groups and I've spoken before non-Jewish groups, and let me tell you, it is many, many, many times easier to speak for a non-Jewish group. They're much more polite and they're much less challenging than Jewish groups. But there are limits. You can't go to an Orthodox synagogue and start questioning the rabbi publicly. Certainly, was this written? Was this really given by God to Moses, the Torah? Does God exist? Does God have an interest in our lives? Like there are certain questions that, generally speaking, would not play well within Orthodox Judaism. So the questioning of the rabbis is not over the existence of God. Is God good? Does God care about how we act? There's no questioning on those lines. It's questioning about how do we perform this particular mitzvah? What is the meaning of this text? What is God intending for us to do in this situation?
I mean, again, it's about context. I mean, I think you can have those kinds of sessions of questioning in private.
In private, but you don't want to go into an Orthodox synagogue and go, hey.
Because that becomes confrontation and potentially, the shaming of somebody else, which is bad in Judaism. So it's about how you do it and where you do it. It's about a sensitivity, I think.
Could you discuss the binary presented in the novel between the world of the Ribbono Shel Olam and that of the Sitra Achra, where you see it very much right now here on your camera? You see I'm dressed in holy garb, with my fringes, with my yarmulke, and there's like an entire aura of piety that just emanates from my countenance. By contrast here, my professor, look at these long bare arms. Now you say, Luke, you've got long bare arms. Yeah, but she's a woman.
Right.
So in traditional Orthodox Judaism, she would not be able to
I'm wearing a dress.
Get away with. Yeah, but it's a very short skirt.
No. Hits the knee. It's perfectly acceptable.
It's not perfectly acceptable. It comes from the word of the Sitra Achra.
I've done worse.
And she's dressed much worse than this. Like, oy vey.
My hemlines have grown.
Yeah, her hemlines have grown. So imagine this. They've grown to where they're now an inch above the knee. So just imagine. I don't even want to think that way because it takes me away from Hashem and His Torah. Oy vey. early on, Chaim Potok shows characters struggling to determine from which side Usher's painting gift comes from. Does the religion at its base characterize all things this way, or are some things viewed as neutral morally, leaving it up to the individual to determine its moral end? Judaism is very obsessed with order, like making separations between male and female, between adults and children, between holy days and secular time, between Jews and non-Jews, between different plants, between linen and wool, between kosher and non-kosher food. So Judaism, the Torah, Jewish tradition are constantly trying to separate. So Judaism definitely believes in good and evil. So some things are good and some things are evil. But there are also many things that are neutral, such as a knife. A knife can be used for good, to cut challah on Friday night, or it can be bad if you use it to stab an innocent person.
But Potok's more interested in illuminating the tension between the two things that might be divided or binaries or polarized in some regard. He's showing us the tension that exists, and that's what makes him interesting. This is making me think of Cynthia Ozick. She wrote a great short story, The Pagan Rabbi, that deals with really a similar kind of tension and a similar kind of struggle between, this guy he's Jewish, he's artistic, he wants to paint, he wants to do all sorts of other things, and then this sensibility that tells him that he can't do that as a Jew. So, I think what Potok's getting at is the tension, is the conflict, is, what's virtually an impossibility sometimes, I think, of completely separating these things into binaries and acting as if there's no interplay between the two, or there's no kind of movement or conflict or tension between the two.
Yeah, there's certainly a teaching within Judaism that there's nothing in this world that's not capable of holiness, that cannot be lifted up and elevated to God. Where does Asher Lev's painting gift come from? So there is not a tradition of rabbi painters in Jewish life. So Chaim Potok was a painter, but he was also a conservative rabbi. He was not an Orthodox rabbi. I don't know of any Orthodox rabbis who are prominent painters. I don't know of any religious Jews who are prominent artists who are using the visual arts, such as painting. So Dennis Prager makes this point that if you want to see an exhibition of Hillel's works, you'll have to go to the Talmud. It's in words. So there's no tradition in the Jewish tradition of rabbis as painters and artists.
The Jewish tradition is very, very textual. It's a very text-centered tradition. So, in many ways it makes sense that religious Jews aren't necessarily going to be artistically inclined, other than through the medium of text.
I think Aristotle said that the sense of touch is a very base one, and the Maimonides, the Rambam, had a similar view. So there is a real skepticism of sensual arts in the Jewish tradition, and just its focus of Judaism is on creating moral change in a holy community. It's not on producing gorgeous operas. So most of the great classical music composers are German. The Italians have produced great food and great fashion. Australians have produced beer. Different people have different gifts. So the gifts of the Jews are being world-transforming philosophies.
Yeah, but then but there have been a lot of very famous Jewish painters. Think of Rothko. Think of filmmakers. That is an artistic medium, film.
Right. None of the prominent Jewish painters were Orthodox.
No, absolutely not. No, that's true.
Number 10. How would you describe Judaism's relationship to sensuality? On the one hand, much of its ritual seems to engage the senses very deeply, yet members of the community often seem uncomfortable indulging the senses outside a scripted ritual form. One, Usher's parents do not want to embrace or touch in front of him. Can you comment on this? Let me tackle not touching in public. So it's inappropriate from perspective of Orthodox Judaism to touch the opposite sex in public, because for one thing, you're only permitted to touch a family member or your spouse in